At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 4 on today's agenda is pre-legislative scrutiny of the general scheme of the prohibition of certain products containing plastic microbeads Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to today's meeting from Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, Dr. Roisin Nash and Dr. Anne-Marie Mahon, and from the National University of Ireland Galway, Dr. Kevin Lynch. From Irish Cosmetics, Detergents and Allied Products Association, Ms. Siobhan Dean, and Ms. Dean is also in attendance with Mr. John Shea from the Cosmetics Europe. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Dr. Anne-Marie Mahon to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation for us to come here today and engage on this topic. It is of particular interest for us as we're very active in the area of research of microplastics pollution. In our opening statement, we've outlined the sources and some potential impacts of microplastics. And I'd just like to reiterate from the statement that we are in support of this proposed bill. Now I would like to present some of our work carried out currently and previously. We have investigated some sources and pathways of microplastics. Is it possible to have the presentation shown?
Have you? I have mine here. Have your presentations?
Yeah.
Everybody has them physically.
Okay.
We'll try and get them up as well. Yeah.
Yep, that's okay.
You don't have them, do you? Have you a spare one there, Trish? It's there. Yeah, we'll get copies. Just for Siobhan. Sorry, Anne-Marie.
That's okay.
Yep.
Can I proceed?
Yep.
We have been funded. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about microplastics sources and what we know about pathways to the freshwater environment. In 2015, there was a desktop study carried out, funded by the EPA, and this outlined some potential sources of microplastic pollution in freshwater environments. It also identified some high-risk catchments.
It's only for members. Trish will
yeah,
go
that's
through
okay.
it as
Is
you
that
go
okay?
through it.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, I'm happy with that. The study identified some catchments which had potentially high-risk microplastic pollution, and we also did a smaller scale study in which we were able to quantify some of these microplastic levels and describe some of the sources. With particular relevance to microplastics coming from industry, we visited some industry polymer companies. Two of these, one was polymerization processes took place, and another one had machining of microplastics. And what we found was, even though these were quite well regulated plastics industries, with their own on-site treatment, they still emitted quite substantial numbers of microplastics to the sewer. As well as accidental emissions to sewer, we also identified some allowable discharges to sewer, which takes place excuse me, due to the lack of regulation of microplastics in industry currently. In our plastics industries, there would be an allowable suspended solid loading, which is quantified as milligrams per litre. This can equate to quite high levels of microplastics emissions. This problem of allowable emissions has also been flagged internationally by Lechner and Ramble in 2015, as they quantified high numbers of microplastics coming out of an Austrian recycling industry. Including the accidental emissions to sewer and the allowable emissions to sewer, there's also the potential for accidental spillages within industry. For example, spillages onto factory floors or onto the surrounding hard substrate outside. And there remains a potential for runoff into stormwater drain, or perhaps direct runoff into fresh waters. Currently, the EPA have funded GMIT to carry out, and UCD as well, Sources, Pathways, Environmental Fate of Microplastics project. And in this, we are now looking at this potential for plastics to be found in the vicinity of plastics industries by sampling the sewer drain and by sampling the potential for direct input, looking at nearby watercourses. This work is currently ongoing. Pathways from the sources into our sewers has been examined by several researchers over the last number of years, including ourselves. What we can summarise is that many sources, such as emanating from industry, landfill, stormwater drain, and the domestic use, such as washing machines, drainage, enter the wastewater treatment plant system. Upon entering, the microplastic loading is then partitioned into what comes out into the receiving waters and what is captured in the sewage sludge. And what we found that there's a high capture rate within wastewater treatment plants of roughly 90%. In Ireland, these microplastics, which are incorporated into the sewage sludge, may find a way back onto land through spreading of sewage sludge practices. The rest of the 10%, which wouldn't be a low number, either also ends up into our rivers, lakes, and from here we don't really know where the microplastics go or what impact they may have on the environment or human health. Some other sources that we're currently investigating included microplastics emanating from construction industry, as it has a very high plastics demand, and also from AstroTurf pitches or artificial pitches, playgrounds. So we have carried out sampling, and we're currently analysing some of our data, which we got from this, but really what we want to see is how the plastics are spread or are transported from these sources, and if there is a danger to nearby watercourses. Preliminary results show that aspects of the construction design dramatically reduced leakage of microplastics from AstroTurf pitches. This includes construction of boundaries and other features. Other sources and pathways that we really want to know is how, once microplastics may become land spread, how are they then transported, or are they transported overland into nearby watercourses? And in our current study, we're looking at the potential and the mechanisms of overland movement and runoff from rainwater, as well as vertical migration of microplastics. This is done through a series of experiments and field work. We are also looking at the potential for microplastics in the freshwater environment to be transferred through the food chain. We're also monitoring microplastics in a number of water courses, particularly in the Slaney catchment. Preliminary results from this work show that all the river water samples so far contain microplastics, with the majority of these microplastics being microplastics fibres. We've also found that microplastics have been present in all of the invertebrate species which we have captured from the rivers. In terms of intervention, just very simply outline, want to point out some of the points of intervention. And I guess before the product, there's a high number of clean-up initiatives on beaches and rivers, and while it's very useful and important for the surrounding ecosystem, I think more emphasis should be put on intervention at an earlier stage. And of course, prevention is the best, so we are very in support of legislation or regulation to reduce the production and use of plastics. This may also be feasible through awareness campaigns, consumer-driven initiatives. Once the plastic also, in terms of product design, there is great scope for intervention there. Once the plastic, microplastics or plastics have reached the environment or are in use, effective waste management and potential change of industrial practices are very important ways which could dramatically decrease the leakage of microplastics into the environment. Once the microplastics reach the receptors, such as a wastewater treatment plant, as I've pointed out, this is a great point at which microplastics could be captured and well managed. So we could say the technological upgrades of treatment plants to deal with microplastics and improved waste management of sludge drives from wastewater treatment plants. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of cleanup. Once the microplastics are in the environment, there are a number of cleanup initiatives. The last slide there is just showing my team who help to make this research come true. And now I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Roisin Nash, who's going to give you an insight into microplastics in the marine environment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Having heard about the potential sources and pathways of microplastics in our waterways, it makes sense to look at estuaries, inlets, bays and oceans to their probable destiny, but also a source of secondary microplastics. All habitats and species mentioned hereafter can be taken to have recorded microplastics. Studies have reported a ubiquitous recording of microplastics in the Irish marine environment. GMIT have experienced marine microplastic scientists answering a number of research questions which involve the identification and quantification of microplastics in seawater, sediments and biota. Our aims are to build on the knowledge base, particularly in an Irish context, to produce comparative standardised methodologies, to improve comparability throughout Europe, to increase ocean literacy through providing information on microplastics in Irish commercial species, and finally through taking an ecosystem-based approach to our research using Irish case studies. Looking at the earlier studies on microplastics, a lot of focus both in Ireland and outside was on building a knowledge base. Dr. Amy Lusher did her PhD on microplastics in GMIT, where she began to show the ubiquitous distribution of microplastics in seawater off her course and the presence of microplastic both in mesopelagic fish and in true beaks whales. Dr. Heidi Akambora also did her PhD in GMIT on microplastics, and she began to show the high levels of plastics in beach seabirds through carrying out beach bird and colony surveys with the help of citizen science. She helped to develop and apply European methodologies for necroscopies in Ireland. The results of her research have led to the use of OSPAR Ecology Quality Objective to reduce the levels of litter or plastic particles in Fulmar stomachs in Ireland. And current research by Andrew Power, a PhD candidate on a Marine Institute Cullen Fellowship, is looking at seabird eggs to reduce the levels of hazardous substances in seabird eggs. Niall Keogh continues to build a knowledge base on the interactions of seabirds and marine litter both inshore and offshore. Ledana recorded microplastic across latitudinal gradients, including upwelling in the Atlantic Ocean, in seawater sediments and sea ice in the Arctic sea basin. I guess the next important area we are focused on is methodologies. Some research led by Dr. Anne-Marie Mahon is exploring the use of different plankton nets to sample surface microplastics using Galway Bay as a case study, and this has resulted in providing recommendations on sampling and processing of microplastics in surface waters in Europe. This research will also provide valuable Irish data on the levels of microplastics and types of microplastics in our backyard. Building on this research, GMIT is particularly invested in quality control and rigorous scientific standards and microplastic research. This naturally led to our involvement in Basement, a JPI Oceans project with the Marine Institute as the Irish funders. This involved research by Dr. João Frias, Dr. Anne-Marie Mahon, Dr. Ian O'Connor and myself, and has resulted in the production of European standardised methodologies for seawater, sediment and biota, and recommendations for future monitoring. Research into commercial species is important for both increasing our knowledge base, but also as ocean literacy is increasing and customers are more aware of microplastics, they are very interested in any potential risks associated with seafood. We have researchers who have examined the intestinal tracts of several pelagic fish, the Dublin Bay prawn, and from numerous fishing grounds around the southwest coast. The blue mussel is regularly consumed in Ireland, while the common prawn is largely exported. They have both recorded low levels of microplastics in their intestinal tracts. We have several research projects exploring research questions in spatial differences and potential behavioural changes. Also, the lugworm, best known for its use as bait, has potential to result in the bioaccumulation of microplastics up the food chain to its predators. With so much research focused both nationally and internationally on individual species and habitats, we felt it was important to take an ecosystem approach and get a better overview of what is happening within a single bay. And so we have Elena Pachter, a PhD candidate, and Dr. João Frias using Galway Bay as a case study to build a more complete picture to the current state of microplastics in the bay to inform both policymakers and the local community at large. Based on the research presented here and the fact that for many products there are numerous feasible alternatives that may be utilised instead of microplastics, we are in support of the general scheme of the prohibition of certain products containing plastic microbeads Bill 2018. Thank you.
Thank you, Roisin. And I'd like to call on Dr. Kevin Lynch to make an opening statement, please.
Thank you again for the invite by the committee. I have not brought a presentation like the last time. What I'd like to do is just maybe comment on the bill itself. The bill, as it's presented, seems to be pretty comprehensive from my point of view. And as we saw at the last meeting and the presentation here by my colleagues from GMIT, there is quite a lot of evidence now in an Irish context that microplastics are a problem. From our studies, we saw sediments, the sediments contain microplastics, both from historical pollution events and continuing pollution events. And the reason this is a problem is because the microplastics within the environment essentially looks like food to the organisms in the environment. And so they consume it as if it is food. It can then bioaccumulate, cause direct impacts on those organisms that feed on it, and bioaccumulate as higher predators feed on these lower organisms. And from our work, and again, Roisin just mentioned the blue mussel and the nephrops, we have evidence that there is microplastics in both of these species in Galway Bay and on the west coast. So there's evidence that it's in the food chain. So that's a real cause for concern. With this evidence that we've presented, or that GMIT have presented and we've presented in the past, we can see that there's a potential problem, but we can also add to that international research in this area, and it's confirmed right across the globe. At the moment in Norway, the same species have seen microplastics in them. So we can, from that, extrapolate and say that this is a real problem. And rather than wait for really extensive research just in an Irish context, invoking the precautionary principle is a really good idea, and that's part of the bill. And we really welcome that as part of the bill to say, rather than waiting and getting all this research over the next number of years, that we will actually invoke the precautionary principle and act now and try and prevent additional primary microplastics entering the environment. The clear definition of microbeads to be inclusive of all plastic particles in the size range within the bill is again welcome. It was less clear in the last bill, so this is very clearly defined and makes it very easy to understand what exactly the bill covers. So that's good as well. In terms of the penalty for breaching the law, my reading of it, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but it looked like a €500 penalty. It didn't seem adequate for the purposes, so I suppose that's a question to the committee if that's correct or not. But overall, I think the bill looks like a really good addition to our attempts to tackle this microplastics problem in the environment, and I welcome it in its current state, and I think it looks like a good bill to proceed with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Siobhan, do you want to have you an opening statement?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wish to thank the committee for the opportunity to consult on the prohibition of certain products containing plastic microbeads Bill 2018. ICDA is the IBEC group representing Irish companies engaged in the manufacture, distribution and sale of cosmetics, detergent and allied household products. The cosmetic and detergent sector take this issue of plastic aquatic litter seriously and share the overarching goals of the Irish Government and indeed the European Union to address this challenge. I am joined today by John Schaaf, the Director General of Cosmetic Europe. Cosmetic Europe is a European trade association representing over 4,500 companies and national associations in the cosmetic and personal sector in Europe. The cosmetic and detergent sector is an industry that has taken a positive action in the occurrence of plastic microbeads in the marine environment. Building on the voluntary initiatives taken by its individual member companies, on the 21st of October 2015, the Cosmetic Europe issued a recommendation to its members stating, in view of the public concerns expressed over plastics debris in marine environment and given the availability of alternative materials, Cosmetic Europe recommends its membership to discontinue the wash-off cosmetic products placed in the market as of 2020. The use of synthetic solid plastic particles used for exfoliating and cleaning that are non-biodegradable in the marine environment. Results of the 2018 data collected by Cosmetic Europe show that between 2012 and 2017, the European cosmetic industry phased out as much as 97.6% of plastic microbeads used for exfoliating and cleaning purposes in rinse-off cosmetics and personal care products. The European industry is on track to achieve 100% phase-out of plastic microbeads by 2020. Our voluntary action is taken in spite of being widely acknowledged that the cosmetic sector is a minor potential contributor. Studies estimated a potential contribution of between 0.1% to 2% of the total aquatic plastic litter. This potential minor contribution is ever decreasing as progress has been made towards the completion of the phase-out of plastic microbeads. In fact, by far the largest potential contributor of microplastic marine litter is from breakdown of bigger plastics, for example car tyres, plastic pellets and microfibres from clothes. Similar to the personal care product, the use of microbeads in home care products is very limited and is further decreasing as several companies have already announced their intention to formulate their product to be more environmental friendly way. In 2016, the European Commission studied to support the development of measures to combat a range of marine litter sources. Detergents and maintenance products were not identified as key contributors to the marine plastic litter. This sector traditionally makes a very limited use of materials that could qualify as microplastics. But the acknowledgement of potential litter streaming from secondary microplastics during the washing of synthetic textiles, the industry, through the European Trade Association AISC, is actually engaged in a cross-industry agreement with European industry associations representing the global value supply chain of garments and their maintenance. This agreement, referred to the European Commission Strategy for Plastic, supports the need for further investigation and better understanding for the prevention of microplastics released into the environment during the washing cycle. It also aims to find feasible solutions based on science and research that can be effectively applied by industry, consumers and authorities. To conclude, we believe that the voluntary action taken by industry is proving extremely effective at removing plastic microbeads from products. Any proposed ban on microbeads in detergents, rinse-off personal care products must be supported by clear definitions to operate effectively. The proposed microbead definition in the general scheme is too broad and as a result would prevent Irish manufacturers manufacturing rinse-off cosmetics and detergent products that would otherwise be permitted in other EU countries. It would also remove many products from the Irish market until they would be reformulated. The business and consumer impact in the general scheme does not take this into account. Pending the outcomes of the Eco-REACH restriction process, it is essential that the smooth functioning of the European single market not to create regulatory barriers to trade, and we would encourage the scope of any regulatory measures proposed aligns with already existing national member state legislation, such as in the UK and pending Northern Ireland, to avoid disadvantaging the Irish manufacturing industry.
Thank you very much. John, do you want to add anything?
No, I have nothing to add.
Oh, great. Grace, you're up first.
Okay. I have a bunch of questions. So in terms, Dr. Mann, of your research, freshwater, you spoke about pathways. So, I mean, do I take it that the pathway of your research goes into an area of the coastal environment as well? Because, I mean, the rivers flow into the sea and that, and so is, that's where the plastic will end up? Or?
Yeah, so the reason that we started doing some freshwater research was there was already a lot known about microplastics in the marine environment, a lot of research carried out, but very little about where they were coming from and how they were getting there. To date, we don't know exactly how plastics transition from land to sea. We know that all plastics in the sea come from land originally. So some may be carried there directly, but we would suspect that rivers are major corridors. So in our research, we do, in this particular project, we don't go down to the estuary, but we are starting to add on now more research to bridge the gap between the freshwater and the marine. So, for example, we have an estuarine study starting this summer.
And where, can you say where that study will take place?
Shannon estuary, yeah, just to look at what plastic loading we're actually looking at. We're starting to look at macroplastics to see what's coming out of the rivers.
Yeah. Also, in one of your slides, I think it was the third one, you speak about, you show again pathways. And one, it says, potential pathways of microplastics from industry. And if you look, have you got that there? You'll see
yes.
When you have emissions to atmosphere, and I wonder,
yes.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
Some microplastics are very small, depending on what polymer type you're talking about. They can be also very light, and they can be dispersed into the atmosphere. So some researchers in Paris have looked at the atmospheric fallout of particles and found that it can be actually quite significant. So I have the box in there just to highlight that out of industrial processes or any processes, or tire dust and a lot of sources, you can have a lot of microplastics that are actually transported on the wind, if you like, in the air, and they come down then somewhere else later.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important to acknowledge that this pathway is there.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I'm concerned that when you talk about the pathway to, in terms of through the sewer system into the different, so you have the anaerobic digestion, the thermal drying, the lime fertilizer.
Yes.
I'm very concerned about the fact that waste is reused, recycled, and could be ending up as a fertiliser on our land. Is that possible?
Yes, sewage sludge is used as a fertiliser for tillage, not for crops for human consumption. There are regulations or guidelines regarding the application of sewage sludge. For example, there would be regulations regarding the distance from a watercourse, which isn't, and what kind of weather you should or shouldn't spread in. Some sewage sludge is applied untreated, most is applied treated, and these treatments, which we looked at in one study, have an impact on the microplastics, so they can actually exacerbate the problem by breaking the particles down further. And of course, one of the main, I suppose, threats or reasons why we're concerned about microplastics is the size. The smaller they get, the more environmental compartments they can penetrate. They can go into the lower bottom of the food chain and be transported up readily. Once they go into the nanometer range, then they can cross, a cell membrane, and so the smaller they get, the more concerned we are about it.
So essentially, like through the use of this sludge on land, the plastic is being dug into our soil, and even if it's just being used for tillage, nevertheless it's part of a bigger ecosystem. So,
yes.
I mean, other species, and even if we go to our lugworm,
yes, or a terrestrial worm.
Or worms.
Yeah,
so, I mean, it's
exactly.
really very
So,
invasive across all ecosystems.
yes, so we're currently intensifying our investigations on land, and we're taking some sediment cores on sites which have been land spread with sewage sludge for 20 years to see what the vertical profile of the microplastics would be. And we hope that from that we will get an idea of whether the microplastics will be mobilised after a rain event, therefore increasing the risk to local nearby watercourses, or whether they would be transported vertically and perhaps enter the groundwater. Either way, it's not ideal.
And then, in terms of ecotoxicology,
Yes.
so it's something that we've been hearing about in the media, that the particles of plastic, be they micro, macro, nano, of this polymer. So it's, if you look at the base, could you just tell a little bit about this ecotoxicology, how the plastic might attract other kind of chemicals? That not only do you have that polymer, that little piece of plastic, but you get an accumulation of toxins around that.
Yes, so it comes back largely, there's two aspects. There's one is the polymer itself has inherent chemicals within it. Some are plasticizers and some are additives to give that plastic whatever function that it should have. So these plastics can leach from the plastic, and the smaller the particle, the more readily these processes will happen. Additionally, microplastics can absorb pollutants in the environment, and they have actually been used in various situations as mop to mop. And there has been some studies done to show that, for example, if a small invertebrate ate some microplastics, the level of persistent organic chemicals in the animal will have reduced once the plastics have gone through. But the problem is that they are a vector of pollution. So they can attract, for example, polyaromatic hydrocarbons and transport them. Whether these chemicals are absorbed or desorb or let go of the pollutants, this is affected by pH a lot. So it's a concern that in the gut where the pH is lower, that this promotes the release. This could promote the release of the toxins. Also, of course, the particles that are going through the wastewater treatment plant interact with a lot of pathogens. And one study has shown that microplastics downstream from a wastewater treatment plant have more pathogens on them, which would be associated with that pathway.
And then just, I know this is very specific, but, you know, I'm on the Climate Change Committee here in the Oireachtas, and like in terms of, as you talk, kind of leakage or emissions, or, you know, like they're hydrocarbon based, I suppose. So is there anything in terms of climate change, do you think it's plastic in general is a negative in terms of
the combination
and the whole?
Yeah, we'd be worried about maybe ocean acidification and some interactions with the plastics in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think yes, I have a question for Dr. Lynch with regard. You speak about microplastics, but this legislation isn't dealing with microplastics.
Yeah, so microplastics as a broader grouping of primary and secondary microplastics, whereas this bill is just dealing with primary microplastics in one particular industry.
Yeah, so microbeads it's dealing with, as opposed to microplastics.
Yeah, but I'd say in a more correct sense, a microbead would be considered something that's spherical in nature, whereas within a particular size range, which is the way it's classified here, it's anything within that size range. So it's not just a spherical shape, it's any shape within that range. Yeah. So that would be, in addition to micro beads that you would consider a spherical shape, you know, anything that's flat, you know, different shapes within that size range.
But I suppose my question is with regard to, is this legislation going far enough? Because like the microplastics are something also coming from the synthetic clothes we're wearing, aren't they?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. And so these are secondary microplastics,
okay,
where you're dealing with a product that may be a larger size at one stage and then it breaks down through whatever process. So if it is fibres from clothes, through the washing process, they're losing these and they're breaking down into smaller and smaller components.
And then getting into the ecosystem and then
exactly,
part of the bigger problem. Yeah.
And you know, one of the things is they are secondary microplastics, so they're not being directly introduced in as a raw material. They're a larger plastic when they're being manufactured and used as a raw material, and so this isn't concerned with those types of plastics. Yeah. That's something for another day maybe,
okay.
and that needs to be tackled as well.
And the last question to yourselves is, your funding, where does it come from for your research?
I think if you see the last slide that I had in my presentation, I put, it comes from everywhere. It comes from the EPA, the Marine Institute, the department itself has funded. Anyone who's anyway interested in the environment or interested in any questions related to the research are willing to fund this. There is the JPI funding from Europe, so Ireland puts money into a European pot that we can bid for money. Horizon 2020 will have targets for microplastics. It's seen now as one of the biggest I guess pollutants coming along line, and everyone wants to solve it. So there's a huge amount of, I guess, research funding out there.
And I suppose specifically, is industry working with you to try to resolve this problem?
We haven't approached industry at all in any of our research projects, but maybe.
Yeah. Well, I have had some collaborations with industry. Some have been fruitful. However, it is the biggest challenge is to get data from industry, as generally speaking, the individual companies wouldn't really welcome you coming to sample for a potential pollutant. They would maybe worried about what any consequences that would have. As a result, I have gone into the stormwater drains in the industrial estates now to see what's coming off collectively and try to intercept at certain companies the drain, because it is very, very difficult to engage. Yeah.
But also, I suppose, local authorities in terms of filtration systems. But I'm just going to move now to
Victor, and I'm going to come back to you then. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Siobhan or John, do you want to come in on anything there? that was asked?
I can just comment a little bit about your question about microplastics and microbeads. You're absolutely correct that the major source of this problem is secondary microplastics. But there is a European process, as I think the committee is aware, which is looking at intentionally added microplastics across a range of industries, not just our industry. So there is a slightly broader process in hand at European level, which we can talk about a little bit going forward in the discussion, if you like. But of course, intentionally added microplastics, which I think colleagues from GMIT agree are only a small fraction of the problem, and the bigger problem is the secondaries such as tyre abrasion and so forth.
Thank you, John. Victor, I'm sorry, Kevin, just to alert you, there's two different types of penalties under Head 13. So one is the first one you were talking about there, and the second one is on conviction on indictment to a fine not exceeding 3 million or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or both is there as well. So there's different penalties under different headings as well. Have you a copy of this?
I do, yeah.
You do, sorry, Victor.
Firstly, I want to thank the panel for coming in. I think it's very interesting. It's clearly quite a technical area, and therefore I think we were right, and I think the department was right initially to engage with the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology and its researchers. I think it was a good move, and I want to acknowledge the support of the department in encouraging that, and also to acknowledge the work that we've seen in the presentations here today from UCT, Earth Institute, the EPA, which have been involved in all of this, and of course your good selves and GMIT and the Marine and Freshwater Research Centre. So it's a very, very technical thing, I suppose, and I'm very conscious also of what Siobhan said in relation to the commercial activities and about the European single market. And I suppose what I will kick off first is to say that the issue, maybe all of you could talk about this whole area of the EU REACH programme, which basically registration, evaluation, authorisation and restriction of chemicals. And how this hasn't all come into effect fully yet, so therefore how do we dovetail our legislation and of course the issue of this legislation coming on, and I suppose then to talk about the European Chemical Agency, the ECHA, because they ultimately manage all of the technical issues around all of this issue. So you might just talk us through a bit there in terms of that issue, because you also mentioned, Siobhan, about REACH and maybe some suggestion that this all might be a bit premature. I personally don't think it's premature. I think when you have experts like Dr. Kevin Lynch coming in and talking about, the challenges that we now have microplastics in our fish and in our food chain, that's an alarm bell for us, has to be. I think we've known about it for a long time. I also want to just acknowledge the work of my colleague, Senator Grace O'Sullivan, because she's raised this constantly in the Shannon, and I know is an expert in this area and has really driven this in terms of Shannon Air and this piece of legislation. So really I think this whole thing about REACH, what is the story there? How does it dovetail with this? I personally don't think, I think we better be ready, and better that we can this legislation can move in on that. Two other issues I'd like you to talk about. What's your engagement in terms of this research with the local authorities? We know that they are a licensing body. We know that they're responsible for monitoring, for instance, various hospitals. I know in my own local authority with the issues in relation to the release of pathogens into the sewage system. There are many breaches of these licences across the 31 local authorities, but it is the local authorities' mandate. So they do, for instance, they do sampling, regular sampling, they do reporting. I personally believe they don't report enough. I think there needs to be a greater focus on these drain and attenuation tank, particularly in the chemical industry, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry and in the hospital sector. There are huge concerns about pathogens coming into the water streams from the health hospital sector, and I think alarm bells should be running there, and I've seen some of these myself, so therefore I have a little knowledge of them. But you might just talk about that in terms of research. Maybe, can I suggest, if you haven't already done so, that you might engage with some of the local authorities, look at their data, because it's all about data at the end of the day. This is a science, and I think you should do that. And secondly, have you had any experience in terms of your work with Teagasc? And Teagasc, as you know, have outreach. We know in terms of grant schemes under EU farm payment schemes, etc., and environmental initiatives, that we have, there will be soil cores, soil bores, there's analysis of those. We know again from those that the profiling of these cores show various issues there, pollutants in the soil, and these are standard regulations now down with European regulations for funding for various agricultural programs. And I again think you could glean a lot of information there. But the alarm bells have to be ringing when we're now told that we have microbeads in our food chain, and that's something we have to sit up and do. So I welcome this legislation. I think the more scientific research and technical research and validation that we can have in relation to this legislation, the better. But as I say, I would particularly like to focus in then, Siobhan, in terms of your organisation, the ICDA, and tell us how the private sector and the industry has been engaging, because clearly it's in your interest as well. People are becoming much more environmentally friendly. People are looking at the back of products. They're asking, is there microbeads used in your products? A lot of people are becoming very, very conscious of where microbeads are, be it in the cosmetic industry, be it in the detergent industry, be it in the agricultural and horticultural sector, because we know microbeads are used in some fertilisers to assist in the distribution of those fertilisers. So these are challenges for us, and I'd be really interested to hear, because I'm always conscious of industry, but I'm also, you know, we want responsible responses, if you know what I mean. It's not enough to say that it's going to impact on our profits. It's not enough to say it's going to impact. The environment is critical for us, for this generation and in generations into the future. And I would long argue that people are really, really conscious now when they're purchasing in terms of how a product impacts on this environment. But I think this whole European REACH thing is, I'd like to know more about it. And again, I want to thank you for engaging with the committee this morning.
Thanks, Victor. Siobhan or John?
I can comment initially on the REACH process, if you like, because that's an interesting and important question. Ireland isn't the first country in the European Union to initiate legislation on microbeads. The UK has legislation, France has legislation, Sweden has legislation, Italy is just implementing legislation, Denmark is planning legislation. And this presents a little bit of a problem, because if you have different legislations in different member states, then potentially you have an issue with the EU single market. It's a bit like something similar happened in the USA when you had initiatives at state level on microbeads. And at some point, the federal government in the USA said, well, you know, this is breaking up the US internal market, if you like, so we need a federal measure which will be common across the US market. So there's a strong case on single market grounds for a European measure. Now, a little bit of history. There are two possibilities of addressing this at European level. You could have a regulation or a directive which goes through the European Parliament in a sort of what we call an ordinary legislative procedure, or you could have the ECHA REACH process. And rightly and understandably, there's been an awful amount of lot of concern, perfectly articulated by yourself, about this problem and the need to address it, not just on single market grounds, because it's recognised that it's an environmental problem. And so the European Commission decided not to go along the ordinary legislative route, but to go through the REACH process. Now, REACH is essentially a system for managing chemicals. But within the REACH process, the European Chemicals Agency has the power or the capacity to recommend to the European Commission that they restrict certain chemicals. And that is the process that we're going through. Now, why was it down the REACH process and not down an ordinary legislative process? Well, at the time, it was thought that this was slightly quicker. Sometimes the processes in Brussels, as anybody who's ever worked there knows, can take an awful long time to get through. And there's a sense of urgency about this. And it partly explains why the Irish government wants to push forward this legislation. So the ECHA process was begun. It was begun last year, the year before last actually, at the end of 2017. Now, this speed element is all a little bit relative because ECHA does take a little bit of time. I think there are 2 or 3 things to note about it. Firstly, it's completely harmonising, so it addresses the single market problem. And that means for the Irish legislation, whatever you choose to adopt here in Ireland, I fully appreciate your sense of urgency and your wish to push forward, will be subject to the European legislation. So essentially, if your legislation is in conflict with the European legislation, then the European legislation will take precedence in the normal way of the single market. That's not a controversial comment to make. The second thing is that this is not likely to be completed until around 2021. It's difficult to say for sure when it will be finished. Where we are now is that the ECHA Secretariat had a year to present a dossier. They've done that. They finished it on January the 11th and they published it on January the 30th. So you can go onto the ECHA website and see their initial work. Now, the second stage of the process takes place, where the dossier has to be considered by a committee of the European Chemicals Agency called RAC, the Risk Assessment Committee, where they'll assess the risks involved. And one of the requirements for a restriction process is that you demonstrate a risk, not necessarily a litter risk, but a toxic risk. That's a slightly controversial part of the legislation. The second part is that there'll be a social and economic assessment, so they consider the impact on industry. And I know this is something that you want to talk about in the session today. And that process will take another year, so that will take the most of 2019. Then around 2020, there'll be a recommendation, and finally, all the other things being equal, around 2021, this process will be finished. And then, as I say, the Irish legislation will be subject to that. You need to bear in mind that the mandate of ECHA goes slightly beyond what you're considering in Ireland, because, as I said earlier in my comments, it covers all intentionally added microbeads, and microplastics, I should say. A small fraction of the overall problem, which is much bigger than intentionally added microplastics, but that's what it considers, and it considers it across a number of sectors, not just our sector. So that's that. Now, other European countries are pressing ahead with their legislation. There is a certain amount of political pressure to press ahead with legislation. There's really recently a debate in Portugal where legislation was tabled, and they said, well, wait a minute, let's wait until ECHA has decided what they're going to do. But it's understandable that you might want to push ahead and not wait for ECHA. But you need to be aware, I think the take-home point from this is that 2021 is overwhelmingly likely there will be a restriction on microplastic in some form. It may be slightly broader in scope than you're currently proposing because it addresses other sectors, and the Irish legislation will be subject to that. So that's my sort of little take on ECHA. I don't know whether you want to add anything or correct anything if you disagree. No.
Victor had some questions on other...
In terms of Teagasc and the local authorities and your synergies with working with them?
Yes, we have some synergy in that they have for assessing microplastics in groundwater, which is quite difficult to assess. They have some boreholes that they use to measure phosphorus, I think some nutrient pollution. So we have a link with them, but we have to wait because technically we need a lot of high volume of water. So we have to wait for this opportunity, to get the heavy rainfall, and then. But yeah, that's our synergy. In terms of the cores, we have with our partners in UCD. We have equipment for doing our cores, and we would be quite specific about how many replicates and where we take them to get the best information out of it. So we'd rather, carry that out independently. In terms of our synergies with or interaction with the local authorities, in 2015 we did have some interactions with them whereby we were able to sample in the wastewater treatment plant and get some idea of what was coming in and what was going out. But now we're subject to Irish water approval. So it takes, we've just completed an agreement which allows us permission to enter the wastewater treatment plant system. So in our 3-year project, it started 2 years ago now, that's planned for this a year ahead.
Could I just ask on that, in terms of this Irish water approval thing, are you finding them extremely cooperative, or are you finding it slight restrictions imposed on you? Because clearly there's always going to be conflicts with Irish water in terms of, because it's a service provider, it has SLOs and agreements to provide in terms of its local authorities and its national remit. Can you tell us just about your experience in Irish water in relation to this specific work, research, scientific work that you're doing?
Sure. So we've had a lot of engagement with Irish Water. I guess they had, we had to come to an RDEA agreement, which would specify how we would take, not necessarily the minutiae of how you would take the samples, but how the data derived from the sampling would be managed. and it took a long time to agree on that. It was 2 years basically in the doing. There were issues regarding vetoing of results, or as academics we need to know that we have use of our results to publish in the scientific for scientific advancement, and also for the well-being of the environment and human health. Yeah, so I suppose it's been a bit restrictive, because where I initially wanted to sample, we couldn't for various reasons, which they stipulated. So any treatment plant maybe that was upgrading, was due an upgrade, it wasn't possible to go there. Also, I would have liked to have had some treatment plants that represented an industrial input, but we didn't manage to gain permission to those. So in the end, because it shortened the amount of time that we maybe would have carried out the research, we had to keep it simple. And we got permission to 3 wastewater treatment plants. Ideally, we would take the samples ourselves. Unfortunately, that's not possible. And the reason that we would like that is that contamination is a big issue because of the clothing fibres.
Could I just come back in this, Chair, and then I'll finish on that? I mean, I'm alarmed that you're saying that when you talk about the word the vetoing of results, that has to be of concern to the committee, and in terms of your work, and also that you can't carry out these examinations yourself. That again has to be of concern. And in relation to something that we may have to raise with Irish Water. So I think it would be helpful if we could have some more sort of facts about it, because when you're trying to make a case, you need to be armed with facts. And I presume you keep a log of your dates and your entries and your requests, because I think that it has to be now really something of concern. And you talked about independence. I have to say, in terms of Teagasc, on the other hand, they would do soil sampling boards all over the country in relation to funding, and they're a very reputable organisation, and it's tied down to very strict, stringent guidelines by the EU. And therefore there may be a case there of greater synergies rather than duplication, because clearly it's in their interest. They police this right across the agricultural sector, so you may not need to be replicating yourself there, and you get a national impact. And I know about the water tables and the soil, etc. That's very important for your accurate readings. But what you're telling the committee here today, and correct me if I'm wrong in my interpretation of what this is, that you have found that in certain cases in relation to water, Irish Water, that you talk about sort of vetoing results, and that has to be of concern in terms of the accuracy and the uniformity of your research. And that's something I think that it would be helpful to the committee if you had further details and you're in a position to make them available. I think it's something we'd like to learn more about.
Yes, we have, like I said, we had long discussions with them, and we did come to an agreement that we are satisfied that we can utilise the data in a way that we can communicate to the scientific community and to government bodies what our results are. It took a long time to get to that point. Regarding Teagasc, just one point to make. They do, we do engage with them, but we have very specific questions that we want to answer in the commissioned EPA study. And one is about the sewage sludge. So we want to actually go to fields that have been spread. And unfortunately, they weren't doing any sampling, on those sites, because they wanted to avoid the human impact, to look only at the nutrients.
Yeah. Thank you.
You wanted to come in on something there, did you?
Well, I guess I just wanted to clarify in case there's any misunderstanding as well as regards Irish Water and the universities. It was the first research project that they would have been engaged in, so that probably explains in part the length, because it wasn't just GMIT. All the colleges, once they were putting together what they were going to sign off and what they were going to allow, it couldn't have been just GMIT, so all the colleges would have had to go to their legal department. So I think it was just unfortunate that ours was a 3-year project, and coming towards the end, we're only now getting into it. So I think it was multifaceted on all parts that it has come to that. And I guess on the other question, like Emery has mentioned on Teagasc, definitely we'll be looking at taking them on board when we are replicating or we're doing more in our study. At the moment, we're trying to answer research questions, and then we're going to test it in the field. And it'd be brilliant, like you said, to bring them on board and look at where they're sampling and not replicate it and see can we give more information towards it. the last point I'm going to make is, as regards local authorities and industry, in all our research projects we would have an outreach element, and we would try to involve them in any workshops or any information that we would produce and get information from them. And so we like to open two-way dialogue. I think as regards the funding that you mentioned earlier, we haven't had a research question that they need to answer and that we need to answer that would kind of tie together, to come together. But I think there will be down the line definitely more interaction with industry, but just the questions we're asking at the moment, we would need to answer them before we bring and ask industry on board to answer more questions. Sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on your question about industry. You're quite right, of course, to express the view that consumers are getting more environmentally aware. And of course, industry needs to respond to that. So I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the recommendation and the action that Siobhan referred to in her statement. So going back to around 2012, in some cases a bit earlier than that, some companies started to phase out plastic microbeads for exfoliating and cleansing, which was what they're mainly used for in cosmetics and personal care products. And in 2015, we, Cosmetics Europe, encouraged our membership to phase out plastic microbeads for exfoliating and cleansing. So we made the voluntary recommendation that Siobhan read out in her statement. That was in 2015. Recognising, of course, that this is an issue, recognising that people expect us to be a responsible industry, and recognise that we are a responsible industry, so we did so. Now, it's not enough simply for us to put some words on a page in Brussels and say, there you are, membership, go out and think about that. So we undertook to follow up to find out whether it was the case that industry was indeed phasing out these plastic microbeads. So we did a survey in 2016, and we found at that point that around 80% of plastic microbeads had been phased out. Now, when we made our recommendation, we said up to 2020, and we got a little bit of kickback about this because people were saying, oh, well, it's very nice that industry has done this, but why is it going to take you so long? The reason that we adopted that fairly long time frame was we were worried that it would be more difficult for the smaller companies who were putting microbeads into their products to reformulate in time. Now, as part of the ECHA process, we need to make we're required, like other industry sectors, to make some submissions about the social and economic impact, which is, of course, important and something that the committee needs to consider too. So we did an additional survey. And this is where this rather precise figure of 97.6% comes. So just to reiterate that, according to our survey, 97.6% of plastic microbeads for exfoliating and cleansing have now disappeared from the European market. Now, why can we be so precise? Well, our survey was absolutely huge. We, Cosmetics Europe, represent more than 90% of the European sector, nearly all of the multinationals, and through our associations, like the Irish Association of the European Associations, smaller companies too. And we surveyed half of the entire market, more or less, which is pretty statistically sound. Any of you are interested in statistics, but the margin for error was less than 1%, which is normally in opinion polls you'll see 3%. Ours was less than 1%. So we can be pretty confident that most of the plastic microbeads for exfoliating and cleansing have gone, and if they haven't already gone by 2019, certainly by 2020, they'll have more or less disappeared from the European market. Now, probably you have questions about, well, there are some companies who are not members of Cosmetics Europe who weren't covered by our recommendation, or you may have concerns about imports from manufacturers outside the European market, which are fully understandable concerns. But I think that the committee needs to be aware that plastic microbeads for exfoliating and cleansing is, to a very, very significant extent, not the real problem now with this issue. I mean, the problem environmentally is much more about secondary microplastics, tire abrasions, and some of the issues which have been thought about by raised by GMIT. So in a nutshell, yes, you're absolutely right. Industry had to respond. Yes, you're absolutely right. Consumers are more environmentally aware. We did respond. And with regard to plastic microbeads, we've made a very significant progress indeed in phasing them out.
Owen.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everybody for your contributions to date. I mean, maybe let's take a step back from some of the very technical stuff for a second, because I think it's important, I suppose, at a very basic level for us to kind of reassert why this committee has spent so much time, partly at Grace and Deputy Sean Sherlock's request at earlier stages and now with the Ministers. We are all concerned with our growing knowledge of the impacts of plastics in general on our environment, whether it's first or second generation microplastics or single-use plastics. And it's becoming a bigger part of our policy debate, and that's a good thing. And I think the committee is pretty unanimous in taking the view which is these things are bad for our environment and we need to have stronger regulatory mechanisms to reduce the numbers. But it is also important that we're not having this debate in isolation, and I make these points partly just in relation to the debate as to whether we should wait for the European Union process or not. What's been going on within the European Union, the European Commission over the last number of years, not just in relation to microbeads but particularly single-use plastics, has been quite a significant battle between industry and environmentalists in terms of how we deal with this enormous threat. And it is a threat, and we need to be honest about it. And just to put this conversation in context, if you take, for example, the lobbying around the EU's position on single-use plastics, the corporate lobbying budget in engaging in that process annually is between 1.5 and 1.75 million euros. That's the amount of money industry is spending in advocating its case, and it's perfectly entitled to advocate its case for what it wants to see. But there is a general kind of approach which is voluntary agreements rather than statutory enforcements, often weaker agreements rather than the stronger agreements that we're discussing maybe here, albeit in a limited sense. But also far lower levels of transparency in the policy-making process that many member states have. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing individual member states now pushing ahead is because it's been taking so long at the European Union level to kind of progress some of this. The member states are saying, well, we're not going to wait anymore. And okay, clearly it would be better if there was a single EU-wide level, but it's highly likely if and when that comes, that's just going to give us the kind of the floor above which individual member states may decide to have higher levels of environmental standards. And certainly my view would be that that would be a good thing. So I appreciate that we're talking about companies, we're talking about jobs, and we're talking about profits to reinvest in the economy, but we're also talking about our ecosystem and its future viability. And if I'm ever asked to make a choice between adhering to single market principles or doing something that's good for the environment, certainly I have a clear sense intuitively, even if I don't know the finer scientific details of where I rest on that. I just want to get back to the legislation, though, because I had a couple of specific questions for everybody, and I'm genuinely interested to hear people's views. Head 4 deals with exceptions, and we had an interesting conversation with the officials when we were looking at the exceptions. Now, some of them seem to be eminently sensible, like products for medical use and veterinary use, etc. But there was one that I was kind of surprised at, and in the heads it talks about creams, lotions, gels containing plastic microbeads designed, manufactured and sold solely for the purposes of application to the surface of a person's skin to protect it from the harmful effects of solar ultraviolet radiation. When we questioned the officials, they actually said, well, actually there are no products currently available in the Irish market that have microbeads and microplastics that fulfill that function. So it just seemed to me odd that you would include that in your exceptions. I also would have thought, because microbeads don't add anything to the medical value of some tan lotions, for example, they're purely cosmetic, it seems to me odd that you would be almost opening or creating an incentive for people to do that. So I'd like your views, both industry and the scientists here, on that exception. And if you have any other comments just on the exception generally. Most of them seem sensible, but that was just one that stood out as a little bit odd. Head 13 deals with the penalties, and well, the chair is right. There's a number of penalties. There's a low level of fine, the Class A fine, which is €5,000 and up to 6 months imprisonment. There's the penalty in terms of a court indictment, which is up to 3 million and 2 years. I presume your concern is just it's the first one that's likely to be used more often in breaches. And are you saying that just in terms of the summary penalty that it's too low? Or are there other examples of other kind of penalties at a summary level, rather than come to go to court, that might be at a higher fine? And maybe you could elaborate on that. I do think it's important that there's a third sanction, which is the boards of directors. The individuals themselves can be held accountable, something that the EPA has as powers in terms of enforcement of waste management regulations, for example, and those things. But maybe if you have specific concerns about that, I'd be interested in hearing it. And Siobhan, Just one query in relation to your own presentation. So it talks about how the European industry is on track to achieve 100% phase out of plastic microbeads by 2020. That point has been well made. But then your final paragraph, it seems to suggest your concern with the bill as it's drafted is it would also remove many products of the Irish market until the products are reformulated. The business and consumer impacts in the general scheme does not take this into account. So on the one hand, you seem to be saying that by 2020, which is around the time that if we pass this legislation, it will be fully enacted and imposed in Irish industry, there'll be 100% withdrawal of microplastics or microbeads from the products your industry is involved in, but yet you still have concerns. So am I misunderstanding that, or are there certain categories of products that won't be included in that 100% phase out of microbeads that currently are still being produced or sold in the Irish market? Where is your concern in relation to that, given that this legislation, if passed, wouldn't come into effect until next year anyway? Just so I fully understand the position.
Do you mind if I tag on to there, because you asked three of the questions I was going to ask there. So just in relation to the bill itself, is there anything in the bill where you think we go too far or not far enough? Is there any aspects missing in it? And I hear what you're saying about other countries coming forward with their own legislation, and we're going slightly further, I think, than other countries. Just your opinion on that. Are we going far enough? And then in relation to the Irish market and the products that we have, what kind of products, how many products are we talking about? How many will have to be reformulated? And just elaborate a little bit more around that. Yeah.
Apologies. I take everybody's point around second generation microplastics, and I don't think anybody's disputing that. Is there any other EU member state that has started to look at this or introduce legislation or regulations that you can point us to for those of us that are interested in it? I know Grace has raised this before. And likewise from industry, are there any attempts by your counterparts in other areas of business that are trying to introduce voluntary agreements or voluntary regimes in terms of the second generation materials? Or is it only the first generation that's received that kind of attention?
Thanks, Siobhan.
Okay, just to address the question around the bill and the specifics of it, and I suppose just to say the industry is supportive of the environmental impact, and we're very supportive on the legislation, but we just had some concerns in relation to the definition, and that's something that we've highlighted with the department already. And I suppose the definition referred to in the text was used as synthetic water insoluble polymer was used as a definition of a microbead. And just say, like, all plastics are polymers, but not all polymers are plastics. So we kind of wanted to that definition be refined, and the definition to be used would be in line with other legislations in the UK and pending in Northern Ireland as well. So when we're talking about the impact of products, we wouldn't have that research done on the proposed definition that was used in the general scheme. So that's where we're kind of saying that if the definition and the scope would be refined and used the definition of a microbead. Then when we did survey our companies back in 2015, a lot of the cosmetic companies here would be SMEs, and they stated that they weren't adding any microbeads into their products anyway. So we've no evidence at this stage that in Ireland they've been introduced to their products, and any companies that said that they were international, they were being phased out. So in the definition, we're saying of phasing out microbeads, it's the definition of a microbead is to be phased out 100%, but not in the definition that's being used in the existing proposed legislation.
And this is quite important for us to understand. So, are there categories of products that aren't included in the phase out and will be caught by this legislation that you're concerned about?
There would be a number of products that will be possibly could be included just from the detergent side. You're looking at opacifiers. You're looking at encapsulated fragrance. It also possibly could be captured in this legislation. Now, they possibly will be captured anyway in the ECHA REACH, but at the moment they will be captured on this. There's no transition period, and companies would need to reformulate those products. So it means if it was a ban coming in, they would be taken off the market. Companies would need a period to reformulate possibly those products. But the general scheme hasn't done an impact statement on industry on those products with the existing definition that they were using.
John, do you want to come in, anything?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with Siobhan put it perfectly, that all plastics are polymers, but not vice versa. And sometimes a lack of precision around the definitions can lead to a much broader scope of regulation than perhaps you even intended. And that's why we were concerned about the initial omission of the word plastic there, because without that, you rope in a whole range of polymer materials, which most people would not regard as plastic. So,
for us who aren't, I suppose, scientists, give me some everyday examples of non-plastic polymers so we're clear on what we're talking about.
Oh, you're asking the wrong. I'll tell you what I'll do, because you raised the issue of transparency, and I'll address that. What I will do, I'll release to the committee what we submitted to ECHA in our submission to ECHA when we initially started to engage in ECHA, with ECHA. And there you have some detailed analysis of polymer materials which we consider to be plastic and some which we don't consider to be plastic. And also some details around these questions of how many formulations, because you asked that. So I agree with you, it's completely important to be transparent. And we didn't as an industry lobby on the Single-Use Plastic Directive, just for the record. But I think that would help you address those issues. There are questions around, for example, some polymers may be liquid or solid in form, depending on the stage of the process that they're at, for example. And liquid polymers are not generally considered as problematic in this context. It's the solid polymers which are problematic. And then we regard the plastic polymers as being the centre of the real issue. Now, going back to your original question about the scope and what would be covered, you need to think about this in terms of the definition that you have a definition, and also the function. Now, our voluntary recommendation talked about exfoliating and cleansing functions. There are a very small amount of microbeads in rinse-off products which are not necessarily used for exfoliating and cleansing. The actual quantity is extremely small. As a fraction of the overall microplastic problem is infinitesimally small. But nonetheless, if you use a definition without limiting the regulation to exfoliating and cleansing, you will capture some microbeads in rinse-off products which aren't, for example, captured in the US legislation or currently the French legislation. They are, in fact, captured in the UK legislation. And I would urge you to consider the UK legislation here as perhaps a model for two reasons. Firstly, aligning with the UK obviously makes a degree of economic sense, because the UK is so far a major trading partner. We won't go into that particularly unpleasant subject.
How many days left?
No. But, and so therefore you protect the trade element to this. And there's no doubt about it. If you go off on a limb in Ireland, to be very frank with you, you're going to cause problems on trade, not just within the European Union, but also with the US, etc., etc., etc. Probably you don't want to do that. But nonetheless, that UK definition is actually broader than the US definition and some of the other, all of the other definitions currently in place in the European Union. I think the UK approach is something that the industry can live with. I think that while there would probably need to be some reformulation, probably quite a lot of reformulation, then, well, we'll just take that on the chin and do it. But beyond that, I think you get into real problems, not just trade, but the sheer cost of having to reformulate not tens or hundreds, but thousands and thousands of products. And when I release to you our submission to ECHA, you'll see an analysis of different scenarios in which you could restrict polymers, in fact, not just microplastics, and what that would mean in terms of reformulations and impact on the industry, and so forth and so forth. So in a nutshell, I would urge you for the time being to align with the UK. The UK goes slightly beyond other jurisdictions in the European Union. It does mean that there would need to be some reformulation, but I think on the whole the industry could probably live with it. Beyond that, you're likely to get into problems.
Roisin, have you anything you want to come in on? You don't have to, it's just only if you want to.
No, can I ask a question and decide?
Question to me? Only if it's not difficult.
No, it's not. Like you're talking about the ECHA legislation that's going to come in, and obviously you're the most knowledgeable person here. If we, like the Irish legislation is a step towards that, and is the UK, are we taking a step back? Or if we go and align ourselves with the UK definition of microplastic and introduce it in our legislation, are we still going to, in 2021, have to take a step forward to where the Irish legislation currently is?
I'll give you a very frank answer to that question. Okay. The reason I think that you should align with the UK legislation as a maximum is that that will preserve the trade position. When the ECHA restriction is in place, then those trade elements, I mean, with regard to inside the European Union, and all bets are off because that's the new standard. I think that the way that ECHA is going is frankly quite radical if you look at their additional proposals, and is likely to go beyond the ECHA legislation. I'll give you one example of that. You'll be aware that there's a polymer called styrene acrylate copolymer, which is used to pacify some liquids. So when you buy a shampoo or something like that, it's not clear because there's a material in there to make it not clear, to make it opaque, hence the term, a pacifier. And you can have a legitimate debate, if you're a polymer scientist, which I emphatically am not, about whether that material actually meets the definition of plastic and is problematic in this context. I think it's very likely that ECHA will say that is and will regulate that material. Maybe wrong, but I think it's likely. If so, that would go beyond the UK legislation because the UK legislation doesn't deal with that particular issue. So I think that while you may go forward and put into place legislation in Ireland, it's quite possible that in some respects, not all respects, what comes out of the ECHA process may go beyond it in two ways. A, because it will cover more sectors, and you're limiting the sectors in this legislation, but also it may address more materials than are currently covered in the national legislations. So you shouldn't get the impression that ECHA is a big friend of industry in this context, because it's not.
All right. Kevin, do you want to come in on that?
No.
You okay? Anne-Marie?
In terms of the exemptions, any thoughts?
I had presumed that there was a product on the market with the solar UV radiation, and that's why it was in there. I hadn't explored it. Maybe there's a product that we currently don't have. Is there a product that?
What the officials said, it was an interesting exchange. They were saying that they had gone out to see if that was the case, and they had found that there were none. But given obviously that they want people to use suntan lotions, if a product was to become available, they didn't want the legislation to act as a disincentive from it. That was their kind of general thoughts about it.
Are we saying we don't use microbeads and cosmetic products here?
This was just in suntan lotions is what they were talking
about. Sorry, in suntan lotions.
I can comment a little bit on that. It's your statement that microplastic doesn't have any benefit for some of these things is not strictly true, actually, for suntan lotions. Suntan lotions, I think we all accept, have an important health benefit, an increasingly important health benefit. And some polymers, I mean, you can talk about whether those polymers meet certain definitions of plastic or not. I'm not really qualified to comment on that, but enhance the UV quality. Okay. So it's not entirely true to think that polymers put in cosmetics products are there just for pizzazz. If I can put it like that, they're not. They do perform rather important functions, not just in UV filters, but across the piece.
Well, if that was the case in those products, they would be covered by the medical exemption because it's for a medical purpose.
Yeah, is a suntan cream for a medical purpose? Do you think that
when you cancer?
Yeah, but it depends a little bit how you understand that. I mean, if you go and slap some UV filter on when you go to the beach, you don't normally think you're undergoing some sort of medical treatment. It's that you can argue about.
I'm sure parents might disagree when they're putting something lotion on their children, but yeah,
maybe,
take your point.
But it's not absolutely crystal clear.
I'm just thinking that it may leave a bit of a loophole there where products that don't currently have an SPF factor might suddenly get it to keep a microbead in there. I don't know. I'm just playing devil's advocate there.
That's probably the wrong way around. I mean, The key ingredient for a UV filter is UV filter, and European UV filter technology is the best in the world. I can tell you that. But it's unlikely that we put the cart before the horse in that particular context. I don't think.
Yeah, it was based on that. Should we remove it? Should we be encouraging producers to, at the design stage, look at that and look at different alternatives, like rather than leaving the loophole? Or I'm aware of the benefits of it, but should we be pushing it back? That actually at the design stage that they're looking forward, that they're saying, right, this isn't out. What else can we use, and what other options by taking it out rather than leaving it?
I think that the interesting thing about the microbeads phase out was that there were alternatives. There were natural alternatives like kernels and cellulose and so forth. And I think that given what colleagues said about rising environmental awareness, I think that message, not just in our industry but across many industries, is well taken. We need to think about alternatives and so forth.
It's exceptionally complex, isn't it?
It is complex, yeah.
Yeah. Grace, did you want to come back in on anything?
In terms of the ecotoxicology aspect, with that potential of these plastics, attracting other chemicals. I mean, are you doing research in that area? Because we've talked very much about the environmental impact, and we haven't really gone into the health impact of these particles in different products. So in your presentation, Siobhan, you spoke about the industry taking a voluntary action, which is very much welcomed. But, in the case of product design innovation, are you looking now at plastic with regard to the health impact, and not only on human health, not only environmental?
From an Irish context, note that at the present we're not engaging in research on the health impact. And from an Irish, and I suppose the cosmetic and detergent industry is a lot of our companies are international from a global sense. A lot of the industry here is small SMEs that will be involved in the manufacture of cosmetics and detergents, and they wouldn't have the scope to engage in that research. But that's not to mean to say that in the future that there will be some opportunities to do that.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that the cosmetic industry is very tightly regulated in Europe. We have the most sophisticated European regulation for our industry in the globe, and of course manufacturers are obliged to ensure the safety of their product when they put it on the market. So that's something they can't ignore. Although actually I think colleagues would agree with this idea of toxicity in this context is actually quite controversial, because toxicity is something which is being looked at by ECHA. That's part of ECHA's sort of mission, to look at toxicity. But while you can see that the issue around marine litter, the question of toxicity is a little bit more complex than that. And if you're interested in that subject, I would encourage you to keep your eye on the analysis which is going through ECHA, because they're doing a systematic review of all the evidence in that particular space. I think that's something that our colleagues at GM&T will be taking a strong interest into.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any further questions? Have you anything else you'd like to add to the scrutiny or to the bill?
No. Maybe just a final comment. Some of the comments from industry are kind of, we're self-regulating. We've phased out 97%. I don't know how much of that. It's self-surveying. So maybe if there's no independent research, as far as I'm aware, of to back that up. But that may be okay. That's a good way to be going. But what we really need is leadership, and to actually do something in this space to try and tackle pollution and plastic pollution, and that this bill is maybe a first step to that, and to show the public that you have concerns, and at least something is being done. Concrete is being done right now, rather than waiting for any future processes that mightn't be ready until 2021.
Just comment on that. You say it's self-serving. But we're very closely, there's a lot of NGO organisations, understandably, very concerned about this issue of had us, our industry, in their spotlight for a long time. And no one has questioned that this phase-out has happened. No one. People may say, well, it was an industry survey, etc., but no one has come up with any reasonable evidence that we haven't done this. But I go to your second point, which is an important point, and I sometimes worry a little bit about this kind of legislation you have in Ireland, because some people might think, well, we legislated cosmetics, therefore we've dealt with microplastics. You haven't even begun to deal with microplastics if you legislate cosmetics. And this problem is a much bigger problem than the cosmetics and personal care industry. We're an extremely small part of it, and getting smaller because we're the only industry, to go back to a previous question, who's taken voluntary action in this space. I don't know of any other industry who has. And so the broader question of how industry works to address these big issues of plastic marine litter, etc., will need to be addressed whether this legislation goes ahead or not. And that is a much bigger project. And that's not to cast aspersions on what you're doing. I understand what you're doing.
Just to be very clear, this isn't the only piece of legislation and this isn't the only debate about plastics that this House is having. It is one, and we're all very clear, it is a very small piece. But it also is the first, it sets the tone, and it demonstrates, if it passes with the approval of both Houses of the Oireachtas, that as a country we are willing to take leadership, not just on this, but all of the other issues. So single-use plastics is the big one, and that's one that we're equally as focused on, although it doesn't fall within the remit of this committee, it falls within another committee. But given that this is one of the few areas we can get involved in this debate here, I think it's an indication of where we want to go. So don't worry, we'll be coming back for more after this.
I'm reassured, thank you.
Can I thank all our witnesses for coming in today, and a couple of you have been in a few times now, and I want to really appreciate the time that you've taken to come here this morning and inform us with this report. I found that fascinating and actually quite refreshing not to be talking about housing for one meeting, but thank you very much for your attendance today. This meeting is now adjourned. Our next meeting will be on Thursday morning, the 14th at 9:30, and that is an update on all developments with the water sector. Thank you, members. Thank you.